Hi everyone, good evening and welcome to the Sydney Ideas Public Lecture Series at the University of Sydney. I'm Meredith Hall, Program Manager for Sydney Ideas. I'd like to welcome our special guest this evening, Professor Philip Mirowski from the University of Notre Dame, US. I'd like to thank in particular the University of Technology Sydney for where Professor Mirowski is currently visiting for working with us to make him available for the lecture at the University of Sydney tonight. The format for Sydney Ideas is a lecture, about 50 minutes this evening by our speaker, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. We have a handheld mic which I'll pass around for your questions, so just indicate if you've got a question and I will pass it to you. We ask you to use the microphone for your questions because we do record the event and the questions for later podcast on the university website. And tonight we also have ABC Big Ideas from Radio National recording the lecture as well. I'd now like to introduce your host for this evening. Professor Catherine Warby is from the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Sydney, and she's the Network Director of the Biopolitics of Science Research Network. She will introduce Philip tonight. Thanks.
Thanks, Meredith. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce such an eminent speaker for our Sydney lectures tonight. Professor Philip Mirowski is the Carl Koch Chair of Economics and the History and Philosophy of Science and a Fellow of the Riley Centre at the University of Notre Dame. He's the author of, among others, Machine Dreams, The Effortless Economy of Science, More Heat Than Light, and most recently, and perhaps most famously, Science Smart, Privatising American Science, which came out in 2011. He's also the editor of Agreement on Demand and The Road from Mont Pelerin, The Making of the Neoliberal Thought Collective. He is visiting UTS as a distinguished professor. I'd particularly like to thank Dr. Jeremy Walker at UTS for making Philip available for this lecture tonight. So over to Philip.
When I was first talking to people about doing Sydney Ideas, and we were batting around which of the things that I would do, I suggested the commercialization stuff on commercialization of science. And a couple people said to me, well, you know, that's not such a big deal in Australia. You know, maybe people wouldn't be interested in that, although maybe it's not true. People here don't seem to have that kind of sense that their university is being, you know, turned into an entrepreneurial platform for various kinds of knowledge economy. But, you know, just when I was worried that this might be true, on ABC, of all places, along comes a program on the TV, no less, where some guy from America comes along and says, hey, you guys, you know, you've got a gold mine here you're not taking advantage of. You know, you should have lots of startups around, you know, your universities here, and you know, maybe you could even have a Google. So, maybe it is happening that there are people who are pushing your universities in this direction, okay? So, consider me the canary in the gold mine. All right. Now, notice in the title I talk about Ponzi schemes, and a lot of times, especially given the crisis, you think that I'm sort of speaking loosely, but I want to be very clear about what a Ponzi scheme is. You probably know, but let's just get this out of the way. A Ponzi scheme dangles really outsized returns. But of course, the reason the way it was able to do that is because it pays huge dividends to early investors with money that's coming in from all these other later investors who are really after this huge return. And so for a while, you can just keep that going. You see, you can just pay the early people out of the later people, and of course, maybe you're not really making any money. Now, the other point I want to make about this is that many Ponzi schemes don't start out to defraud. Okay, they didn't start off from, you know, year one, I'm going to, you know, do this this ridiculous thing which can't possibly work. Usually they start off as seemingly reasonable projects, but then what happens is that as the investors flow in, the returns cannot be kept up, and all sorts of things start to take place, like faulty accounting, repression of research by outsiders, appeals to the sterling reputations of the proponents. I'm saying that now so you'll recognize it later. Okay? And then when finally illiquidity becomes insolvency, we have entered the world of Ponzi finance. Now the other thing I want to say is that I noticed this because at the same time I was doing the book Science Mart, which this is from, I've been working on a history of the crisis and the response of economists to the crisis. And while I was doing that, I noticed that there were certain similar reactions going on in these otherwise wildly different spheres of commercialized science and some of the things that happened in the crisis. To the point that I decided that one way to get this across is to not simply use Ponzi scheme as a kind of a metaphor, it's like a Ponzi scheme. I want to make the case that this is literal. There are Ponzi schemes in current commercialization of science. All right? Now, I don't know if you know that people, when they're caught up in these schemes, they feel like they can't really get out of them very easily. So, for example, in the crisis, Chuck Prince, who was then the CEO of Citibank, said, when the music stops in terms of liquidity, things will be complicated. But as long as the music is playing, you've got to get up and dance. We're still dancing. Well, does your vice chancellor talk that way? Look, everyone else is commercializing, so we've got to do it too, right? Now, what I'm doing here is I'm summarizing some stuff out of this book called Science Mart that came out from Harvard University Press last year. Now, Science Mart has a lot more in it than what I'm going to deal with tonight. And you can see a list of some of the things there, talking about the neoliberal inspiration of much of science policy, what's wrong with thinking of science as a public good, the economic history of science organization, so forth and so on. Obviously, I can't do all these things here, and it's much too complicated. So what I've decided to do instead is to make a couple of very simple but stark claims. Okay? And the claims I'm going to make here have to do with information from the American experience. So please understand, that's what I'm doing tonight. I'm saying this is true of the American experience, and then perhaps we can extrapolate to what may be happening soon here. And what I'm going to claim is that there are three literal, remember, Ponzi schemes going on in the commercialization of science right now. The first one is the biotech model, which I hope you have all heard of, although I will discuss it somewhat. The University Technology Transfer Office, I'm not sure what you guys call it, but I'll describe it, and then you'll be able to translate, I hope. And then finally, the privatized provision of bibliometrics, particularly by a specific firm, Thomson Reuters. Okay, so that's the main. The main claim is going to be: here are some examples of Ponzi schemes, explicit Ponzi schemes in the commercialization, and that'll lead us to the final question: how is it that these things can persist if I'm right? How can they keep going? What keeps them going? All right. Okay, let's start. What is the biotech model? Now, people often get this confused, and so I want to be very clear about this. The biotech model is not a simple expression of the rise of molecular biology. It is not. It is much more a particular business model with regard to carrying out and the funding of research. It's a business model that did not exist prior to 1975, so it's fairly recent. And in fact, at least in the United States, what it has to do with is the evolution of Big Pharma itself. Basically, Big Pharma found that in-house research was becoming too expensive, and it needed to, in a sense, outsource it. The biotech model is one instantiation of the larger phenomenon of the outsourcing of expensive procedures from corporations. Okay? Now, what the biotech model does is it outsources early-stage drug research to small startup firms, usually in the United States, spin-offs from universities or from the National Institutes of Health, which is the government-funded biological research or medical research. These firms fund research initially through government grants, and I want to stress that one way these things work is they use other people's money and don't pay it back. No, it's really important to see that the part of the way this works is the early money all comes from things like the Small Business Administration and never gets paid back. All right. Then what happens is that once you presumably get the research along a certain route, then you try to draw in venture capitalists. Now, I know that the venture capital situation is very different in Australia than it is in the United States. I'm just signaling that I know that. I'm going to be describing the United States here. Now, the venture capitalists come in, and I'll come back to this. They aren't in it for the long haul. They are in it at most 3 to 5 years. Okay? So you have to think about that this is a short-term participation on their part as well. And what is most disturbing about this whole phenomenon is that biotechs are almost never profitable. See the beginning of my Ponzi argument? Biotechs are almost never profitable because they don't have anything to sell. They're not real pharmaceutical firms. They trade on promises, okay? And they have huge, high burn rates of cash. This is well known in business school study of biotech, okay? You might say, but wait a minute, eventually they become freestanding corporations or drug firms, pharmaceutical firms. In most instances, with very few exceptions, and I do acknowledge that Genentech and Amgen are exceptions here, they almost never become freestanding pharmaceutical firms. Instead, what's the point? To cash out. To either take it public through an initial public offering of stock, or else to be bought up almost directly by some big pharma firm. And that's how the venture capitalists make their money. I want you to be clear on that. They make their money by cashing out, not by making sure that this process leads to a saleable product. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, I know that there's lots of firms that do various kinds of studies about bringing drugs to market. That is a separate sector, and I don't have time for that tonight. That's known as the Contract Research Organization. The Contract Research Organization is the firm that does many of the clinical trials, deals with the FDA, tries to get this to be a saleable drug. So, see, biotech really is early stage. It stops before the real action happens. Pay attention. All right? You already know what I'm going to now claim. The whole model is a Ponzi scheme because the research itself never, I repeat, never makes money. The venture capitalists and the scientist owners begin with government money they never pay back. They promote various prospective possibilities to venture capitalists whose main concern is to cash out before the biotech firm goes bust. And I didn't add this. Most biotech firms do go bust. Most. So most of them go bust. A few of them get bought out. And some people make money in the interim. All right. But the biotech sector as a whole has never made a profit. I bet you never heard that before, did you? See, this is well known in the business literature. The biotech sector, especially if you take out Genentech and Amgen, has never made a profit. So this whole drawing in of investment and paying it out to other people is a Ponzi scheme. Do I have to explain that anymore? Okay. Indeed, the business press is constantly bewailing, and I have many more quotes in the paper. Oh, I'm sorry. Jeez, that got run over. The business press is bewailing, the business model on which biotech has relied for the past 30 years is breaking down. This is a common bemoaning one finds in the literature, okay? Why is it breaking down? See, that's the interesting question. It breaks down because the biotech model can only work in a bubble economy. Because it's a Ponzi scheme. Hello? All right? It can't work in a contracting economy. Think about it. Can you do these IPOs? Can you sell out so easily? Of course not. Hello? All right. Is this really going to be the great deliverance for university finances then? And for those of you who need a little data, here's some data. By the way, it's from Ernst & Young, the accounting firm, because, believe it or not, there's no regular reporting on these entities, so that an accounting firm has to go and try to put together the data to be comparable over time. And what you see is that, especially if you take out Genentech, which is that yellowish line, the sector as a whole doesn't make money. Now, it isn't enough that it simply doesn't make money, although I'd hope that would give you some pause. Neither does it deliver the goods. So it's one thing if not making money, another thing that it doesn't deliver the goods. I don't have time to go into this, but there's huge wailing in the pharmaceutical industry now about what is known as the drying up of the drug pipeline. That is, because it takes such a long time for these things to be developed that people can sort of see, 5-10 years down the line, what's coming that might be a blockbuster, so forth and so on. And the drug pipeline, as you can see there, is, even though the amounts of money that have been pouring into the pharma sector have been rising over time, which is the left-hand graph, the number of new molecular entities, and I apologize, it's going to get technical when we start digging into it, the number of new molecular entities approved by the FDA has been falling through time. So not only does it not make money, it doesn't produce the goods. And here I want to specifically cite some work of Nick Rasmussen, who's at New South Wales, who's doing a book on the early biotech firms. And in particular, he's shown something even more interesting, that the few blockbuster drugs that those early biotechs did have actually were medically dubious in many ways. So yet again, that's all I can say here, but yet again I can say, look, this is the proof of the pudding of the sector. All right. Here's my second case. Now again, like I say, I don't know what you guys call this office, but in the United States, most universities didn't have a special office to coordinate and develop the university's intellectual property until the 70s or early 80s. That's when it started. And this office is called the Technology Transfer Office. Okay, it's usually a dedicated arm of the university who's very concerned to claim and the intellectual property that is being generated within the university. Okay, the way it was sold originally is about, these terrible Ivy Towers, they just don't get the innovations out the door, those academics, all they do is futz around. They don't really, work hard to bring this stuff to market, okay? The truth is, that's not been the real effect of technology transfer offices in the United States. And moreover, remember, we're talking Ponzi schemes here. Moreover, the promise of dependable revenue streams has not been realized for most universities. It's true, one or two have made out like bandits, and they tend to be Stanford and MIT, but most other universities have not made a lot of revenue from this. Indeed, They don't even break even. Ooh, do you feel that Ponzi creeping up on you again? They don't even break even. And they hide the fact with deceptive accounting. All right. In other words, they are enforcers of the privatization of science without actually making money or nurturing research. Furthermore, and I'll talk about this very briefly, some activities of these offices actually obstruct research that's going on at the university. So here we've got these technology transfer offices sucking in university investment, hiding the fact that they are in fact insolvent, harming research in the name of promoting it. Hey, I call it a Ponzi scheme. Right? Now, how does this work? The main problem are the metrics that are used by these officers in order to report what they are achieving. What they love to do is they love to list two things: numbers of patents either applied for or granted, and gross revenue. Now you've got, especially from licensing and other various deals. Okay. Now you should understand, most businesses don't report gross revenue. That's just like the amount of cash that comes in the door before you take out all your costs. Okay? And indeed, many universities treat the cost data as private and inaccessible. That is, you cannot get that information, especially because much of the cost and much of the revenue comes from litigation. And I want to be very clear on this. If you want to play the IP game, it's not a game of tea and crumpets. You got to play hard. You got to be willing to threaten. And by this, I mean not threatening firms, but you got to be willing to threaten your own faculty and your own students. I'm not making it up. I've talked to a number of technology transfer officers. They have been known to sue their own students over intellectual property. That's how you play the game, but that's not a game that you want broadcast very much. Okay? So, what have we got? We've got a situation where these offices are not reporting their true profits. In fact, most of them are unprofitable. They do it through, like I say, wonky accounting, strange accounting. I call that a Ponzi scheme. All right. Now, moreover, they also this practice has been promoted actually by their special trade organization in the United States known as the Association of University Technology Managers, who actually tell the offices how to do this, which is one place that I've gotten some of the information from. All right. Now, how is it that so much of this commercialization is happening in universities when in fact, they really, truth be told, are not making money off of it? See, that's really the problem with this. And what's happened is that this trade association, has paid for a large number of academics to do studies to say that intellectual property development has not harmed the science. All right? And just so that you know that we're not sort of just vaguely talking about, I want to name some names there, and you've got them. Wes Cohen, John Walsh, Steve Hansen, Marie Thursby, actually Paula Stefan's another one that's not up there. These are people who have taken money from the trade organization to argue that intellectual property doesn't matter. But you know what? Because so much of this is happening in the health sciences sector, there are health science professionals who have also tried to figure out, largely by surveys, do you think that, they go around asking scientists, do you think that various forms of intellectual property have somehow stymied your own practice? Have they hurt the development of science in certain ways? And when the surveys are done by health science professionals, you get the reverse result. See, I find this fascinating. They find that people, by and large, scientists, are saying that there has been harm, that there are problems. Okay? What's going on here? And where is science studies in all of this? All right. Part of the trick in understanding this is that if you look at patents, you're looking at the wrong place. Patents happen too late in the process. They take forever. They take 10 years or whatever, and lots of fighting and so forth. Patents are not really where the real activity is happening that causes problems with the science with regard to intellectual property. It's something else. Now, I don't know what you guys call it, but in the United States it's called the Material Transfer Agreement. It's an agreement that actually negotiates over intellectual property before you've discovered anything. Think about that. Isn't that great? It's that you divide it up even before you get there. And so, of course, that's where a lot of the restriction of actual research goes on. These are legal documents, contracts, that divvy up who owns what and who controls what. Okay? And so a lot of this is happening in a place that those people who were hired to argue that there were no deleterious effects don't look. All those people that I named don't look upstream. They look at the patents, and they ask people to say, well, have patents harmed your research program? Well, duh. No, because, it's gone. But by the time you're there, it's long gone. All right. Moreover, it's in no one's interest to argue that these things are growing out of control. And in the book, Science Smart, I demonstrate that material transfer agreements are growing at rates of 20 to 30% a year at universities. So they started off very small in the 80s, and now they're just growing out of control. And who wants to get rid of them? Not the elite scientists who benefit from commercialized science. So you've got to be careful about that. The people who actually sort of run Science Magazine and Nature Magazine are people who have their own startups. So they're not inclined to see a problem. All right. Certainly not the lawyers. I'm telling you, where's the real employment bloat in American universities? Certainly not the faculty. Certainly not, for services to the students. It's this middle manager, lawyer. And this is why. It's because more and more time is taken up to negotiate all of this stuff. And a lot of times, universities say, look, we just have to do it, right? I mean, because those nasty, impugnacious corporations, they want to, hit us up for all they're worth. They want to claim everything, so we got to defend ourselves. But what you need to know is that more and more it's universities who are writing MTAs to other universities. And it's university lawyers who are suing other universities. Universities are doing it to themselves. It isn't all that nasty corporate sector. Okay? This raises an issue. Is the patent system broken? And I am not the first person to raise this issue. There's actually a huge literature about this. Adam Jaffe is a very important guy. Josh Lerner is another one. I just want to point you to that literature, but I want you to consider the following. Why have universities gone so whole hog into wanting to own patents? Well, what has happened in the history of the recent patent system is that the patent office has been weakened in the United States by shifting to a customer model. In other words, the patent office now gets paid by the people who want the patent. Well, that should change their incentives, wouldn't you think? all right? But moreover, the patents themselves are becoming less and less, the quality is falling. And again, you don't have to listen to me. There's a huge argument about what is causing the fall in patent quality over the last 3 decades or so, okay? So just think about it. Patents are worth more, in part because you don't need to really find anything deep anymore to get a patent. I'll come back to that. So they're crappier, but you can use them, of course, in all sorts of legal means to block other patent holders and extract revenue, all right? And at the same time, okay, they are much easier to obtain because of this customer model. So what happens is that patents are worth more, easier to obtain. It's a gold rush, right? Everyone wants them. Now, there's been some patent reform, quote unquote, since then. I don't have time to go into it. Don't be misled by the word reform. It has not gotten better. I think by most analysts, most legal analysts have decided that even under these new reforms, it has not gotten better in the recent past. So, what is my point? My point is that patents don't reward innovation. So you've got to get out of that, too, that little story. By the way, I actually had the schematic from the patent office there of the penile volumetric measuring device, which, of course, had a penis on it, but I didn't want to upset anybody, so I sort of took it out, and it's real. That's its number. As the Undersecretary of Commerce for Intellectual Property said, we are getting more and more unpatentable ideas, worse and worse quality applications. Historically, in the last 40 years, the allowance rate, you can see that there, percentage approved, hovered around 62 to 72%. It went to 72% in 2000, dropped to 43% in the first quarter of 2008. Even the Patent Office is saying that the quality is going down. All right. Now, I want you to think about this. Universities are being encouraged to rush into patenting right when the patents themselves are degenerating. This is a Gresham's law in action. My last example. All right. Now, this is different from the first 2 cases. In the first 2 cases, I had actual either entities or firms that were not profitable. And so, hence, I could make a case that they were Ponzi schemes. In this case, I'm going to talk about a firm that, hey, is profitable, is doing fine, so that's not the issue, okay? The issue instead is its business model. What it does in its business model, I'm going to claim, is an epistemic Ponzi scheme. This is a little harder to understand, okay? An epistemic Ponzi scheme is a Ponzi scheme that portrays science as growing continuously when it is not. All right. Now, see, what's interesting about this is why would anyone want to do that? You see, I mean, what? It just seems so outrageous, so ridiculous. I mean, why would someone want to portray science as growing when it isn't? There's a bunch of things going on here. One of them has to do with the privatization of the data about science. You see, science isn't just privatized. The data concerning science is privatized as well, thus influencing its quality and leading us to this particular impasse. Okay? And by the way, I'm also going to argue it's neoliberal. Now, I know a lot of you think that neoliberal is just a left swear word or something like that. I don't have time to do this. I have a whole book about the history of the Mont Pelerin Society, which describes in painful detail what neoliberalism is. I know exactly what I mean by this. I will come back to that. I am not calling names. So there's also an element of neoliberalism in this, too. Now, you might say, science is contracting or not growing? why haven't I heard of this? Well, you can see that even Science magazine 5 years ago sort of noticed something. But of course, they had to retail it as, well, it's not really a problem. The United States production of papers is just kind of flattening out. And of course it would happen that because the rest of the world is growing, its scientific capacity is growing, of course the United States might look like it's not quite so present in world scientific literature as it was before. You see, sort of noticing something but then explaining it away. No, this is a Ponzi scheme. American science is contracting. It's being hidden. All right. Now, in order to do this, see, you need to know so many things to get around this. This is the pain. This is why it's so hard to convey. You actually need to know who produces this bibliometric data. Now, for many of you, I know myself, bibliometrics is dead boring. How much more, these citation indices and so on. God, who wants to know, right? But you need to know that almost all of this comes from a single private firm. Did you know that? By the way, including all your little citation indices that I bet you look up, they all come from a single firm. Now, it is true, I know someone will come up with this in questions, so I'm trying to block it right now. Now, it is true that, sure, you could use Google Scholar, and you could try Scopus. Hey, I know all about that. All of the actual data that's used to rank your university, to rank you, to produce your little H score, talking to the scientists there, all comes from Thomson Reuters. See, so that's why it matters. This is the one that's used. Okay. Now, Thomson grew out of an organization that wanted to help scholars find, literature. I mean, and that's probably the way you still think of things like Web of Science, right? I'm looking up somebody's papers or, similar work and so forth. That's how it started. But you see, it was bought out back in whatever it is, 06, 07 by Thomson. And do you think Thomson has a business model that wants to help little old you find, who's citing you and where this particular little area of science, it can't make money off of that. Thomson has reconfigured this whole database to largely be sold at extremely high rates to law firms to track intellectual property claims. All right? See, so you need to know things like that, too. Now, so while you're all using this silly little set of measurements to rank your university relative to Chinese, and all this other ridiculous stuff that goes on, okay? The underlying data is not continuous from year to year to year. It doesn't come from the same basket of journals. And in fact, in many instances, it's not even comparison across certain geographic areas as well. Okay? Now, suppose we paid somebody to sort of go get the data from Thomson, clean it up to at least make it comparable. Now, I could tell you where I got this from later if you're interested. Believe it or not, at one time the NSF was sort of interested in this and actually did this. So this is data of American authored papers in, as you can see, many different disciplines, comparable from the same journal set over time. And what do you see? Oh, talk to me. What do you see? In every single area, it is falling. Now, here's what I want to suggest to you. NSF knows this, but doesn't want to promote it. Because what would it say about these decades of privatization of American science and its success? And Thomson doesn't care to provide it because Thomson is a firm. It doesn't want to go around suggesting that knowledge is somehow being harmed by the process of commercialization that it has as its own business model? Please. Isn't that interesting? How come no one cares about this? Huh? All right. Back to the big question. Most common reaction when I start doing stuff like this, the most common reaction is that I'm a conspiracy theorist. I'd like to talk about that in questions if you want. The next most common reaction is, why would universities engage in these Ponzi schemes? Isn't it crazy? Isn't it self-defeating? Remember, this is why I started out this way. Ponzi schemes often don't start out to defraud. They often start out as reasonable, profit-seeking schemes. Okay. What happens is that universities first have to get caught up in a different vision of how knowledge production should be organized. And of course, this is where the neoliberalism comes in. I want to be clear about this because I might not get to the last few slides. Neoliberalism, one of the core doctrines of neoliberalism, is not market good, state bad. That's for the proles. The most important doctrine of neoliberalism is the market is an information processor more powerful, knowing more than any human being will ever or could ever know. See, they have a vision of what a market is. You have to convert the universities to believe that that's what a market is. And then, of course, the policy prescription is obvious, is it not? That you should organize knowledge production along market lines. Okay. I don't know what's happening around your neck of the woods. Maybe you can tell me. Where I come from, more and more, the people who run universities, and by the way, that's not necessarily always the presidents. It's like that next level down, whatever it is. The people who really run the universities are businessmen, often not even faculty members. See, that's what you have to convince people of. That you have to reorganize the entire nature of the university to be more efficient. Okay? So a lot of this is driven, honest to God, by ideology. It's how you think knowledge production works. And the more you get these business people telling you how knowledge production works, the more you are driven in this direction to a certain extent, even if you don't want to. But it isn't just that. There's the other side of it, too. We're living through a crisis, and it ain't over yet. Right? In the crisis, what does the state want to do? It wants to save money, and of course one place that's really convenient to save money and a weak political opponent is indeed the universities. So universities are pressed to accept prepackaged reforms that promise these revenue streams to make up for the cuts that are made on the part of the states and federal level. Right? So even if they don't really want to do it, they're driven into it as a sort of a way of reacting to this contraction that we're all facing. So you see, there are many forces causing this to happen, and they aren't all simple hucksterism. All right. And while it happens, and I want to stress, oh great, you can't read that last part. I want to stress that when this happens, the businesses swarm in to cherry pick the fragmented spin-offs from the university structure, looking for the high revenue parts. See, because one business model, and by the way, this is the private capital model of Bain, people like, in firms like that, is you go into an entity, You spin off the more profitable parts and you starve the other parts. That's what we see in the United States all the time. All right, almost done. This would not have happened simply if universities were in financial trouble. See, it happens at the level of funding, and it happens at the level of intellectual justification. And I don't want you to forget that. You need both. At the level of intellectual justification, it is the increasingly neoliberal orientation of politics that wants to privatize knowledge production because they believe markets are the uniquely efficient information processors. You see, if you allow the state sector to control knowledge production, you're not allowing the heart of neoliberalism to take hold. By the way, do you know after Milton Friedman died, he had a fair amount of money. You know what he put all his money into? After he died? The privatization of state education. Not monetarism, not any of those other thousands of things. That is the heart of their program. And if you take nothing else away from tonight, please take this. It is the heart of the program. Knowledge must be privatized. Knowledge production must be privatized. But of course there's a problem. And I'll quit after this. The problem is, if knowledge production is to be privatized, and we are in a truly free market where everyone's free to choose, why stop at what's true? By the way, this is why my other talk was about climate science denialism. Why stop at what's true? Why not buy the kind of knowledge you wish everyone believed? Why not? And if you want others to believe it, even if it's false, what's to stop from purchasing this kind of flawed knowledge and disseminating it, and thus increasing the full complement of human ignorance? See, this is very interesting. And actually, some of the neoliberals actually thought about this. See, this is why I know about it. That they thought, the market doesn't make everyone smarter, and if anyone promises you that, stop listening to them. They're lying. The market, because in neoliberalism, income is supposed to be unevenly distributed, but if the market is an information processor, knowledge must be unequally distributed as well. Most people will be stupid, and that is one of the purposes of the commercialization of knowledge. I think I'll stop there. Yeah, sure. I think you just press the bottom.
Is it that? No?
Oh,
The bottom? Meredith, sorry, we're having trouble with this mic.
got me.
Sorry. Okay, well, that was clearly totally uncontroversial. I'm sure there won't be any questions. Over to you.
The hills are alive. I think so. Is it working? I was going to sing. No. I've been reading a little bit of Hayek recently. Isn't it the problem that I agree with you, but the problem is equating knowledge with information? Two completely different things.
Well, it depends who you're talking about, who does that.
I'm talking about
if you mean
Hayek's idea of the free market.
Hayek actually has a well-developed, I think, philosophy of epistemology. And it isn't about this kind of narrow notion of information that one might encounter in, like, economics. All right? It's not the same at all. Okay? So I'm not claiming that either. And the story I'm telling is his sophisticated story, not the information story. Okay?
If we were going to convince our university administrators to take a different approach, it would be good to have positive examples of the benefits of the alternative approach. So can you point to University of Notre Dame or some other entity that, by being completely non-commercial and open, has increased the influence of the university? Or?
See, it's very reasonable of you to ask that, but here's where the historian in me kicks in. See, because I think a lot of people who complain about commercialization get this rap that they're nostalgic. They want to go back to the Cold War model. And I don't have time to explain what that is, but a lot of it is about, essentially the state subsidy of both education and research without pushing this knowledge to have immediate effect or immediate application, so forth and so on. Okay. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm some kind of, teary-eyed guy but it is true that United States became a world-class power in science under that method of organization, okay? And now what I'm demonstrating to you is that there's at least some degradation under this form of organization. I don't think there's an optimum form of organization. This may be part of the problem, that we start talking about it like economists. What's the right mix or something like that. Discussing the right mix is a problem because once you start down this road, everything starts to change. And it's very hard to go back again. It isn't just that some of the science is done differently. The way the science is promulgated is done differently. Intellectual property controls much of the access to the actual papers now, right? And the way in which people are recruited is done differently. I mean, now you're living in a world, I don't know what it's like here, but in the United States, if you're in if you're in biology, basically, you get out of your PhD after having worked in somebody's lab, and then you get one postdoc and another postdoc, maybe even a third postdoc, and then maybe, if you're good or whatever, you get to, you see what I mean? And part of that is this whole change that's going on now. The whole structure of research is being changed, okay? So I know people want to say, oh, well, just tell us the answer, right? Just give us the right pop. But see, we're talking about world historical changes in the whole structure of universities along many, many different dimensions. Not that they can't be resisted, not that individually they couldn't be changed, but changing one of them is not going to make a difference. It's just not. That's why for example, let's take intellectual property. I have some friends who are part of Creative Commons. They all think, ooh, copyleft is going to fix everything. And I just have to keep my mouth shut because I just don't see it. Just issuing things through copyleft doesn't begin to get at all the MTAs and the ownership, and you see, it's much more elaborate than that.
Yeah, that was actually my question as well, but I was also wondering what the continuities are between what came before neoliberalism and what is now neoliberalism. So you mentioned the Cold War production of knowledge, etc., and now the sort of rise of metrics and things like that.
Yes.
But a lot of those metrics and measurements arose out of the intellectual developments from the Cold War era.
I
So, that adds another layer of complication to that question you just answered, because if there was no golden age where things were perfectly okay, where do you go from here?
Very reasonable question. This is why one of the first chapters in Science Mart is an economic history of the organization of science. okay? An attempt to discuss over more than a century, not just one, but 3 different modes, I talk of them in terms of modes of organization. And what's very interesting in the United States is the first mode of there's no sense in which it was not commercial and then commercial. And see, that's another place that I think people get tripped up, because they're all tripped up by this state versus market thing, okay? Early world-class science in America was also commercial. Matter of fact, the reason science starts really growing up in the United States is because of the rise of these very large corporate, many of them monopolies or oligopolies, who start building these in-house labs wanting to be like Germany, okay? No, really, that's how it all, see, so the beginning, you could call it commercial. But that commercial imperative made those people decide that they wanted elaborate research in the universities which would help them stock their own laboratories. But you see, now, what's the age that we live in now? Do you see corporations supporting, elaborate, strings-free support of their university research labs now? No. Why? Because for them, they live in a different world. They want to spin off almost all costly components of their business. And one of the main ones that they've spun off since the in-house bloodbath of R&D in the 1990s in the United States. Most people don't know this. That, it used to be most firms had in-house R&D. They all got rid of it. And why? Because, see, science is now fungible. We can buy it from the lowest cost producer, a university, a contract research organization, China, wherever. See? So you're right. I do want to stress that there are continuities, but I also want to stress, which I think people don't stress enough, the differences.
Professor, can you repeat the point you made earlier about the United States becoming a world-class science power? I missed that. Can you remake the point?
That a lot of people say that, the reason it happened was simply because of state subsidy of university science. And that's not strictly true. That the beginning, if we're talking the beginning of the 20th century, actually was this kind of movement that first emanated from very large firms. Because if you know anything about economic history, you know that there was this mass merger movement, this huge concentration that happened in the 1890s to the 1910s in the United States. And part of that concentration movement was they decided that the way that they were, and see, this is another thing about patents, they decided the way they were going to compete against these other big behemoths is they were going to own patents. And if this other firm, tried to do stuff that they didn't like, they would go in and use those patents and make them pay. See, patents actually are a form of corporate control of competition more than anything else. They are not a simple, a simple recompense for innovation. I mean, that is such a ridiculous idea. They have not been that in history. Okay? So, bottom line is actually a certain movement in the organization of firms that started the United States on the path to becoming a world scientific power. But of course, then the Cold War transformed that again.
I just want to say your very last projection says it all. And in passing, you mentioned climate skepticism.
Yeah, right.
So the other thing that comes to my mind is this intelligent design thing.
Yeah,
which
that
is,
too, right.
So you would include intelligent design as you said right in the beginning. Why not buy the knowledge you wish what everyone believed?
Yeah. Except that, again, I want you to understand that many of these movements don't just happen. That there's organization behind them, usually think tank organization. This is another reason why they're neoliberal. That they're identifiable think tanks. For example, do you know that many of the techniques of climate denialism that I encountered since I've been here actually were shipped over from the Competitive Enterprise Institute in the United States? See, they're in contact. They can, once you get this sort of thing going, it's, you can lift it up and put it in another national context, it's fine. And, other kinds of movements are like that too. And the commercialization of science is like that too. It is being promoted by certain think tanks in order to reform your universities.
Hi.
Hi.
I know you've been talking about actual science here, and I think on one of your graphs you did have something called social science.
Yeah, on the
but
end.
You didn't really talk about that.
No.
Maybe you'd like to wrap on a little bit about something that seems to me a little ironic, and that is, on the one hand, we have the queen of the social sciences, economics, which you would think would be particularly interested in and well informed about and engaged with precisely these sorts of issues. They seem to be about markets and so on.
Right.
And yet, on the other hand, at precisely the same time as this is occurring, economics disciplines, at least within Australia, are being eaten alive by their more, quote-unquote, competitive children in marketing and management and so on. Right. Economics seems to be one of the least successful disciplines within the university itself. Why do you think that is?
Now see, this is super interesting to me, but it's cultural because it's not true in the United States at all. It's not. And maybe, let me just report on the United States experience a little bit, and then you can tell me if it's different here. In the United States, some people have been doing some really good work on the history of business schools. Because business schools, there was a couple of different models of business schools in the United States, the Harvard Business School, so forth and so on, which actually were not terribly fascinated by economics, governed by finance and finance theory, so forth. And then what happens is that sometime in the 60s or 70s, the neoclassical economists move in and sort of reorganize the whole business school structure, its curriculum, so forth and so on. And in fact, this is done with the help of the Ford Foundation that wants to make business schools more like a science. It's always a dead giveaway when they start claiming that. The person who's written, there's two people who've written a lot about this, Rajesh Khurana and Marianne Forsad. I can give you the names later. And so what happened is that the business schools in the United States became a major platform for the strengthening of economic orthodoxy. Yeah. Now, see, if that's not happening here, then that's really kind of interesting. And, what are the conditions that allow these different things? And I'm not sure what they are. It would be very interesting to know.
Okay, I'm going to take my chair's prerogative and ask a question. Sorry, Melinda. I'll go first. I was just really struck by the periodization of your argument because if the business model you're commenting on has its origins in 1975, then it also has its origins in the last great fiscal crisis of the state.
Yeah, right.
So it seems to me there's something there about how the business model which has been generated out of one set of crises is now encountering a different set of crises, and this perhaps partly explains the devaluation, the kind of the bursting of the bubble in some ways that seems to be, well, I guess that's what finishes a Ponzi scheme, isn't it? The bubble burst.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people who do the history of political economy would say that the neoliberals sort of first started to have real effect on the economy sometime in the late 70s, early 80s. Okay. And what's very noticeable is many of the aspects of this firm organization that become so important for things like the biotech model actually changed right around that time. Some of you may have heard of the Bayh-Dole Act, although that's overdone. Actually, what's more important for biotech firms is they changed the rule in finance that basically, up until this period, in order to float a new firm on at least the American Stock Exchange, or NYSE, you had to have 3 years of profits before you floated it. And so what happens? The neoliberals come along and say, who needs, you don't need profits. This is entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are the future. Blah, 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 blah. Okay? And so what you do is you get rid of that rule, and bang, you get the rise of venture capitalism. Bang. See? So I mean, they're intimately linked. That, a different conception of how we should organize the economy leads to rule changes, leads to real different forms in the economy, it seems to me.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the labour politics of science. You talk about science graduates being on continuous postdocs, and science seems to be at the cutting edge of the devaluation of academic labour. So I was wondering if there were any rumblings there. I don't know.
Yeah, Melinda, that's a huge question, but one thing that I can point to is the same time these other things are happening, what you see is that the university is unbundling the teaching function from the research function increasingly, very much so. And in a sense, that's the beginning of that kind of spinning off business. You see, you have to make it more discrete so that you can spin off the more profitable parts and sort of thing. And then, the question becomes, what happens to the teaching function? And this is very obvious in the United States. Tenure is going away. That now 60% of all faculty are gypsy faculty. They're on part-time contracts. They don't have regular tenure. They don't have dependable connections to their university. It's coming.
I think it's already worse here.
So I mean, what's happening is first you separate. What the Cold War did was it bound together two or more functions that don't have to go together. They don't naturally go, teaching and research. Not everyone's good at both, right? But what it did was, especially if you take a look at military contracts, they said that the people who were getting the contracts had to teach as well. It's very interesting. And also they funded tremendous amounts of graduate students that way. See, so the idea was that teaching and research would go together. In the modern world, what we want to do is we want to disambiguate all of these functions so that we can more efficiently optimize each one of them.
How do you think it affects the idea of the community of scholars in the sense of Kuhn, where there's this alleged thing called the community of scholars, which has an intellectual function as well as lots of other functions. Is this going to affect it, or is the sociology of science to be kept separate from the philosophy of science?
Well, I don't know about the latter, but I mean, I think you already see that's changing too. I mean, I think one of the most neoliberal technologies, I'm going to offend all the young people here, one of the most neoliberal technologies that I've ever encountered is Facebook. Because it teaches you how to fragment yourself and pretend to be things. And so, you see, I mean, it's all this kind of different conception of what the self is, okay? Believe it or not, I'm asking, do you know what one of the most fastest growing startups is? It's a Facebook for academics. That's what's happening to the community of scholars.
I'm interested in when you talk about you show the evidence for decline in academic progress.
Right.
It makes me think of the function of the ideological function of maintaining the idea of progress.
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of the big hook of these Ponzi scheme sorts of things. And I just wonder, with the US declining in many ways,
right,
and with a great deal of denial, this is part of what it is of the situation today.
All right, that raises all kinds of thorny issues. I mean, I think that I think a lot of these measures are sold as progress, but I also think that because of their attitude towards knowledge, keeping most people in the dark, they don't want to look into it very much, you see. So, I mean, it's a sort of funny thing, is that, you know, look, how many times, or you will hear this, you know, your vice chancellor will say to you, get with it. Everyone's out there, you know, sort of, you know, having effect in the community. You know, these are the buzzwords for, you know, selling yourself. And, you know, that's just going to keep going, all right? I don't know. It's hard to talk about, you know, progress as clearly there's no single index, and that's why I want to be clear about the indices that I have. That they are very specific indices. They don't measure everything. A lot of people don't like bibliometrics. Anyway, you see, I mean, sure, I accept all that. But what's interesting is the fact that they're hiding the information, not whether you think or I think that is a good measure of progress. Okay.
Hi, Phil. I'm tempted to ask you the question that you wanted to be asked, which is, are you a conspiracy theorist? But instead, what I'd like to say, what does it look like when, I mean, you've had to do a lot of work to dig up the bust, right? What does the bust look like when it's undeniable, or is there a kind of quantitative easing of knowledge production which disguises the bust kind of semi-infinitely?
Yeah. Yeah, what will the bust look like? The bust will look like the ultimate fragmentation of universities into a whole bunch of subunits that have to stand on their own. Right? Yeah. I think that's what the bust is. You see? That the university will cease to be a universe, holding together all these strange functions and these odd discussions that don't always lead anywhere and so forth. See, that's got to stop. Okay?
Just wondering whether another potential development out of all of this is the emergence of, and perhaps it's happened, I'm not aware of it, something like an Enron, with teams of brokers sitting around finding ways to trade and speculate on knowledge and ideas. I mean, Enron was all about trying to create markets in new areas and tap into the, I suppose, benefits and energy of them. I'm wondering if anything like that any entity like that has emerged out of this, or could.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but only in certain areas, right? Because we're fragmenting the university, there's not going to be one entity that kind of takes over and alters all those functions. It's going to be like function by function. And I think for teaching, the area that you see is online, these fake online universities. That's the future of, I think, that's the future of cheap teaching to the masses. That's it. Yeah? Hey, it already is in the United States. Do you know 10% of all college enrollments in the United States are online? 10%? We're getting there. Okay? See, but it'll be different for the research, it'll be different again, right? It won't be that. It's going to be something like, a highly tailorized production of knowledge, very narrowly focused to keep the patron happy. And in fact, there is such a thing already. It's known as the Contract Research Organization. The Contract Research Organization exists to get the FDA to say that you can sell your drug. It doesn't exist to learn about diseases. It doesn't exist to learn about the side effects of drugs. It doesn't exist to learn about, oh, look, this disease is linked to this disease, and isn't that interesting? No. It is engineered. All the curiosity is engineered out. So you just produce those stats that will get you the FDA acceptance. There you go.
Can I ask, It sounds like it's a new form of American capitalism, actually, what you're describing. Have you ever had anybody think of outsourcing it somewhere else? Mitt Romney's Bain and Co. is so good at doing that.
Yeah, sure.
It will, sort of help the American economy.
I think a lot of, the biotech actually is shrinking in the United States. So in a way, I'm taking an easy target, right? I'm attacking something that's dying. Where's it growing? China. That's where biotech is really expanding. So, yeah, that's part of it. See, it's all part of the same set of functions. You want to strip down the organization to make it more efficient. You want to spin off certain functions. And ideally, you want to send those functions to the lowest cost producer, usually lowest cost labor. And this is known as rationalization.
Thanks very much. I just want to ask a question about the sort of actors in this story, because what I heard you say was that the prime actors are the kind of the middle management, the university vice chancellors, the technology, all that sort of stuff. Read another way, your story might be read as a story of how scientists and social scientists are increasingly, are very skilled at storing their research in the context of of the time. So scientists are very skilled at telling stories about value, telling stories about impact, telling stories about innovation. So in a sense, scientists themselves are participating in in a quite a marked way.
Yeah, I don't want to make it sound like they're not, they're not actors. They are actors. But I don't want to reduce it to their intentionality, see, which is how I understand your question. It's like, scientists, they've always lied to their patrons. What's new? No, really, I hear this in science studies all the time again. There's this kind of element of science studies that sort of makes excuses for it. I am talking about different engineered structures which didn't exist before 3 decades ago, whose function is to alter the character of knowledge production. Some scientists sign on, others don't. I don't think their intentionality matters. But that's just me.
Okay, I think we can give Professor Mirowski a break and